Welcome back, friends, to the Lifestyle School podcast, where we talk about what it really takes to build a lifestyle that supports your health, your energy, and your long-term goals. When we think about the cell, most people immediately think of the mitochondria because, frankly, we talk about it a lot. The powerhouse of the cell, the engine that turns food into energy. And yes, that's true. We cannot function without them. But here's the thing. If you have 20 to 30 trillion cells in your body, and each one of those cells has to not only produce energy, but also communicate, protect itself, and interact with its environment, then we can't just focus on the engines of these cells, right? We need to talk about the walls of the house, the gates of the city, the border patrol, and if you're like, okay, Hope, where are you going with this? What I'm talking about is your cell membranes, okay? So today, honestly, I'm really excited about this podcast. It's a fun one. We're diving into what cell membranes actually do, what they're made of, which specific fats and why they matter, why the type, source, and processing of fats you eat determine how well your cells function, how natural fats differ from highly processed industrial oils, and finally, we're going to talk about how Nina Teicholz, I believe I'm saying her last name correctly. I'll spell it for you though, just in case you want to look this up, which I highly recommend. Teicholz. His book, The Big Fat Surprise, helps us understand how fat became unfairly demonized and how the mistakes and how that mistake, frankly, has shaped the health crisis that we face today. It's been a part of it, not the whole thing, but part. And so my goal by the end of this episode is that you're going to look at fats in your diet completely differently. That's my goal. And hopefully you'll understand why your health literally depends on the fats in your cell membranes. So before we dive in, though, as always, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that I am not a medical doctor. This is not medical advice. Everything on this podcast is for educational purposes only. And before making any major dietary or health changes, please, please, please consult with your qualified healthcare professional. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that, let's get into it. Okay, let's start with the basics. Every single one of your trillions of cells is surrounded by a membrane, okay? Picture it like the walls of a house, but unlike rigid concrete walls, these walls are alive. They're dynamic, constantly shifting, opening, closing, and responding to signals. I have a really weird mental picture that I'm going to share with you that I always think of when I think of the cell membrane. If you have ever seen the movie Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, I believe it's the first one. The main character, like the son who's like the tech genius that creates the machine that makes all the food. I hope I'm not spoiling this for you. At one point, he takes his weather reporting girlfriend and they jump into like a Jello cake. And they have to like jump through the walls and then they're like bouncing around in there. That's how I picture our cell membranes. I know that's kind of weird, but I just thought I would share it with you. And if you're a parent and you've watched all the movies with your kids, hopefully you get it. Anyway, moving on. The cell membrane has three main roles. Okay. Number one is protection. It keeps the inside of your cells safe, regulating what comes in and what stays out. Okay. Number two is communication. It's studded with receptors that respond to hormones, nutrients, neurotransmitters, and signals from the other cells. It's how your body coordinates thousands of processes literally every single second of every day. And then number three is metabolic control. It helps regulate how sensitive your cells are to things like insulin, how nutrients are absorbed, and how waste is removed. So if your cell membrane is healthy, signals are crisp, nutrients flow, and your cells respond to insulin and hormones properly. But if your membranes are damaged or stiff, communication breaks down. You can kind of think of it like static on a radio channel. Messages get lost. And that's really when things like insulin resistance, inflammation, and chronic disease begin to take root, right? Because these cells can't do their jobs every second of every day. So here's the truth. Your health doesn't just depend on your mitochondria pumping energy out. It depends on whether your membranes, the gates of your cells, are functioning well. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So now that we actually know what I'm talking about, what actually makes up these membranes, right? And the answer is simple but profound. It's the fats that you eat, those fatty foods. The membrane is built from a phospholipid bilayer. Imagine two sheets of fatty molecules back to back. Each phospholipid has a water-loving head and a fat-loving tail, and together they create this flexible barrier. But the type of fat in those tails truly changes everything. And here are the key players. So we have omega-3 fatty acids, which include EPA and DHA. These fatty acids are found in fatty fish like salmon, sardines, and mackerel. And these make the membranes more fluid, flexible, and anti-inflammatory. DHA in particular is essential for your brain and for your retinas. And if you want to learn more about omega-3 fatty acids specifically and omega-6 fatty acids, which we're going to talk about next, I did a whole podcast episode 22. Guys, did you see? I just reference an actual podcast number. Be proud. I made a note of it. Go back to episode 22 from a couple of months ago, and we get into the omega-3, omega-6 fatty acid ratio debate in depth. So the key players for fats: one, omega-3 fatty acids; two is omega-6 fatty acids, which is linoleic acid and arachidonic acid. These are found in nuts, seeds, poultry, and vegetable oils. You need small amounts for signaling and for inflammation control when it comes to omega-6 fatty acids. Sometimes I think they're demonized, but they are actually essential. But they have to be in the right amounts. In the American diet, omega-6 fatty acid intake is about 10 to 20 times higher than omega-3 intake, which leads to all sorts of issues that we talk about in episode 22, but it also leads to stiff and inflamed cell membranes. So take note. Number 3 fatty acid is monounsaturated fats. So oleic acid, the star of olive oil and avocados, okay? They help balance fluidity, they resist oxidation, and they keep your membranes resilient. And then we have saturated fats found in things like butter, dairy, coconut oil, and animal fats. And what they do for your membranes is they give them structure and stability. So think of them like support beams in a house, but too much without balance can make membranes too rigid. Okay, and then to round things out, to end things, we have cholesterol, which is not technically a fat, but it's essential. We have to have cholesterol, guys. Cholesterol fits between the phospholipids like mortar between bricks. And what that does is it regulates the fluidity so that the membranes aren't too stiff or too floppy. Okay? So the point is, when you eat, you're not just fueling your body for energy, you are literally supplying the building blocks for your cell membranes. Okay? Eat the right fats and your cells become resilient, flexible, responsive. Eat the wrong fats and your cells become stiff, inflamed, and honestly metabolically broken. And that leads to all sorts of issues and frustration. So now we ask, how do these fats make it into our diet? And why does the way that they're processed matter so much? And I think this is a really important thing to talk about. So let's compare, shall we? So traditional fats, think butter, olive oil, coconut oil, tallow, and lard. These are produced through simple natural processes. Butter, is churned from cream. Olive oil and avocado oil are cold pressed. You just look at an olive or hold an olive or you hold an avocado and you can tell it's oily, right? Your hands are oily after touching it. Tallow and lard are rendered from animal fat. And then coconut oil is pressed from dried coconut meat. Minimal processing is required. There's no solvents, no high heat. They still contain natural antioxidants like vitamin E and polyphenols. So um, now compare that to industrial seed oils and the process that they go through to become an oil. Think corn, soybean, canola, cottonseed, safflower, and sunflower. In, comparison to olives and avocados, if I hold corn in my hand, like the last thing I'm thinking of is like, oh, this is oily. Honestly, I think it's wild that we get oil from these non-oily things, and we're gonna get into why that is. So, seeds and grains that don't naturally yield much oil are crushed. In many of them, it's actually in like the germ, I believe, is where the most oil is, which is really hard to extract. And what they do is they're treated with petroleum-based solvents called hexane to pull out every drop of fat. It's a quite intense processing process. And the crude oil that comes from corn, soybean oil, canola oil after we use this petroleum-based solvent is dark and it's smelly. So what they do is they refine it, and then they bleach it, and then they deodorize it with high heat. And by the time it hits our supermarket shelves, it's a pale yellow and it's a flavorless liquid. And, then all of our recipes call for these different corn, soybean, vegetable, oils. And the problem is these oils are loaded with delicate, and I mean delicate, polyunsaturated fats that oxidize easily. And if you're like, what does it mean for it to oxidize? We'll get into it in a second. And they oxidize easily during processing. So during storage and also during cooking. So processing, storage, and cooking, they're so fragile and delicate. These polyunsaturated fats are very likely to oxidize through any of these different uses or even just sitting on the store shelves. And when you fry food in them, or when they sit on the shelf for months in your cupboard or in the supermarket, they produce toxic byproducts like aldehydes. And we'll talk a little bit more about aldehydes in a minute, but so why both butter and corn oil are technically fats, they could not be more different in how they're made and what they do in your body. And there is definitely a reason why industrial seed oils are so much cheaper than things like olive oil and avocados. It's because they are like a byproduct of a very cheap commodity that's used for all sorts of different purposes, right? That doesn't necessarily make it good. And so this brings us to the concept of oxidation, which I wanted to talk about. And why does this matter so much? Well, fat oxidize, or sorry, when fats oxidize, they produce lipid peroxides and aldehydes. And what these are is they're highly reactive toxic compounds. These molecules don't just sit quietly. What they do, unfortunately, is they attack your proteins, your DNA, and most importantly, your cell membranes, okay? And what this leads to is all the things we don't want, things like insulin resistance, damaged membranes impair your insulin receptors. They lead to inflammation. Oxidized fats activate inflammatory pathways. They lead to mitochondrial dysfunction. So toxic byproducts clog up energy production. They can lead to atherosclerosis. Oxidized LDL is what actually drives plaque, not just plain LDL. And then neurodegeneration. Aldehydes like 4-HNE are linked to Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So, in other words, oxidized fats don't just give you bad cholesterol, quote, bad cholesterol. They are active toxins that disrupt your metabolism, literally on every level. And so, maybe you're wondering, well, how did we get here to where we have these industrial seed oils? Why are, lard, tallow, butter, not as much dairy products, but why are some of these things demonized? Well, I read this book a number of years ago and I thought it did a really good job talking about the shift in the nutritional sciences landscape over the last 50 or so years. And so I think to understand why fat has been so misunderstood, we need to look backwards to the mid 20th century. And I want to talk about this book, The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz. So for decades, we've been told to fear things like butter and cheese, red meat, and eggs. We were literally told saturated fat was the enemy, the thing clogging our arteries and causing our heart attacks. And because this narrative, we were good little listeners, we stripped natural fats out of our diets and replaced them with things like margarine and shortening and vegetable oils. But here's the thing. That entire story was built on very shaky ground. And that's what we get into in the book, The Big Fat Surprise, that Nina Teicholz. I'm going to spell her last name for you again if you want to look up this book. I'll also link it in the show notes, but her last name is spelled Teicholz. And she does something really incredibly powerful. She spent nearly a decade digging through old nutrition studies, government archives, and scientific papers to uncover how saturated fat came to be demonized, and how the supposedly, quote, heart healthy alternatives we were told to eat may have made things worse, things like margarine and vegetable oil. So, let me walk you through some of her key revelations in this book. My goal is to kind of give you like a Cliff Notes version. I seriously recommend everyone read this book. It's very good. It is very long and very detailed. It's like pretty dense, but hang with me and I will give you kind of the outline. So it all begins with a guy named Enzel Keys. You've probably heard of him if you've been in the nutrition space for any amount of time. You've maybe heard of him or maybe not. But he's a scientist in the 1950s who prompted the idea that saturated fats and cholesterol caused heart disease. He presented his now famous 7 country study, which seemed to show that nations with higher saturated fat intake had more heart disease. But here's the catch, and it seems like there's always a catch, right? Keyes actually had data from 22 countries, and he cherry-picked 7 that fit his theory and ignored the rest. Countries like France, where people ate plenty of butter and cheese but had low heart disease, he didn't include in his 7 country study. But despite these flaws, Keyes was charismatic, he was very persuasive, and his diet heart hypotheses gained traction, and soon it was shaping policy on a governmental level. So in the 1970s, this idea had become official. The US government released the first dietary guidelines for Americans in 1977, urging citizens to eat less saturated fat and cholesterol. And what this did is it opened the door wide for the food industry, companies to replace butter and lard with things like margarine and shortening made from hydrogenated vegetable oils. The, quote, low fat craze took off and supermarket shelves filled with, fat-free cookies, low-fat yogurt, and processed snacks, all loaded with sugar and seed oils. And, it wasn't just about science anymore. Agriculture and food manufacturers had a stake in promoting vegetable oils, especially things like soybean and corn oil, which were cheap byproducts of farming. So suddenly these highly processed oils were being marketed as heart healthy, quote, I should say, quote, heart healthy. But one of Teicholz's biggest points in her book is that the science never really supported the demonization of fat. There was large, well-designed studies that didn't confirm that saturated fat caused heart disease. In fact, many of the early studies that appeared showed a link that was observational, meaning they could only show correlation but not causation. And what it came down to is people who ate more red meat and butter also smoked more and exercised less, especially in mid-century America, and those confounding factors weren't properly accounted for in these studies. And I will just say it, nutritional studies are incredibly difficult to do because there are always so many variables and confounding factors. Yet, despite the lack of strong evidence, the low fat message hardened into dogma, and gosh, words are hard sometimes, guys. Scientists who challenged it were often ridiculed or silenced. And I will say, quite frankly, I think some of that is still going on today. And so what happened when we all followed this advice? Well, we cut out eggs, red meat, butter, and cheese. Not totally, but in a lot of ways. We replaced those with vegetable oils, margarine, and fat-free processed foods. And to make low-fat food palatable, because, low-fat food isn't typically as delicious. What manufacturers did is they loaded them with sugars and refined carbs. And the result is instead of lowering rates of heart disease, we got skyrocketing obesity, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome. Our cell membranes became flooded with unstable omega-6 fatty acids or omega-6 oils, making them more prone to inflammation and oxidative damage, unfortunately. And so, in this book, Teicholz highlights how when researchers later went back and looked at the data more carefully, the picture was clear that saturated fats were never the villain. And some meta-analysis actually showed that no significant link between saturated fat intake and heart disease risk was there. There was no significant link. Meanwhile, high intakes of refined carbohydrates and excess omega-6 seed oils correlate far more strongly with metabolic dysfunction. So even the 2015 US, or wow, guys, I'm really struggling to talk all of a sudden. What I should say is even the 2015 US dietary guidelines quietly dropped the long-standing cap on dietary cholesterol in their guidelines as a subtle acknowledgement that the science had shifted. And that was a really big deal back in 2015, about 10 years ago. So the biggest insight from the book, The Big Fat Surprise, is this, that and I think it's really good to just like be aware of this, that nutrition science is not just about evidence, unfortunately. It's about politics, it's about personalities, it's about industry and entrenched beliefs, unfortunately. For 50 years, we built our food culture around the idea that natural fats were dangerous. And in doing so, we replaced them with industrial products that are far worse for your health, in my humble opinion. And I do believe there is evidence more and more emerging to back that up. And this is why the oils lining our grocery store shelves aren't olive oil and avocado oil. They're soybean, corn, and canola oil. And this is why, those quote low fat labels still dominate the shelves of our grocery stores, even though we know better now. And so, this is why your cell membranes, which should be built from balanced, stable, whole food fats, are instead being constructed from unstable, oxidized oils that were never meant to be the foundation of human health. And that causes a lot of problems, right? So when we look at, the metabolic mess that we're in, the prevalence, 1 in 3 Americans have insulin resistance, obesity is out of control and on the rise, diabetes, fatty liver, heart disease, all of these major issues are going up. We can't just talk about sugar. We have to also talk about fats, right? Not just because fat is inherently bad, but because we've been told the wrong story about which fats we need to be mindful of and which fats we need to embrace, right? And Nina Teicholz, in her book, The Big Fat Surprise, reminds us to go back and question the dogma and reevaluate the evidence, which I think is always important because the fats you choose are literally shaping the structure and the communication of your 20 to 30 trillion cells. which is a really big deal at the end of the day. So, what do we do with all of this information? I know that was kind of a lot. Here's the bottom line. Your cell membranes are made of the fats that you eat. Healthy membranes require a balance of omega-3s for flexibility, monounsaturated fats for resilience, saturated fats, and cholesterol for stability. Okay? Natural fats like olive oil, avocado, butter, ghee, fatty fish, pastured eggs, nuts, and clean animal fats build strong, healthy cells. And things like industrial seed oils, corn, soy, canola, safflower, sunflower oil build weak, oxidized, inflamed cells. This isn't just about calories or macros, it's about the structural integrity of our cells. And if you want to improve your metabolism, your energy, your hormones, your long-term health, you have to care about your cell membranes. And that means caring deeply about the quality of the fats that you choose to eat. So, next time you're at the grocery store, don't just ask yourself, is this low fat or is this heart healthy? Instead, ask, will this fat help my cell membranes communicate, protect, and thrive, right? Or will it make them rigid, oxidized, and inflamed? Because every single day, with every bite, we're choosing the raw materials for our trillions of cells. We want to build them well. And if we do that, our body is going to thank us for decades, right? And so with that, guys, I know there was a lot in this episode, a little bit different format than what we typically do. But if you found this episode helpful, I'd be so honored if you'd share it with a friend. Maybe someone you know that is still afraid of saturated fats, butter, or olive oil. And if you're ready to take the next step in understanding how your lifestyle, fasting, and nutrition can transform your health, come join us over in the Lifestyle School for Weight Loss course and or my 8-week personalized coaching program with Lifestyle School. I would love to walk alongside you during your health and weight loss journey. And this is where we take the science and actually put it into practice. And so with that, guys, if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel, leave a comment, leave a review, and have an absolutely amazing Friday. And until next time, take care of your membranes and they will take care of you. Okay, have a good one, guys. Talk to you later.